You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hancock, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hancock here with fellow panelist Christopher Zender. This week, the Open Door explores our current cultural convulsions. Dr. Curtis Hancock, long of Rockhurst University, is our welcome returning guest. He has close ties to Poland's Lublin School of Thomism and is currently the coordinator of the History of Philosophy concentration at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. And yes, he's been known to write mystery fiction. But we'll begin with a prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Professor Hancock, Curtis, if I might, what are some causes of social unrest in America today?
Yeah, well, there are many, but I think the one that stands out for me is just simple hatred for America. Somehow there's just this incredible hatred for our country out there now. I've been struck by this for some time. I just couldn't believe sometimes in class I'd be teaching and I'd be talking to faculty and I'd speak to other people in the wider public, and I've just been struck by the hatred and hostility people have for America. You know, when I was growing up, whether it was from my parents or the parents of the kids I hung out with down the block, or from what I would hear on television or what I'd hear from the wider culture, it was presumed that America was a good country. America had its dark episodes, every society does, but on balance, America was a good, even noble country. You would hear things like American exceptionalism, and you took that seriously. And you grew up with that sensibility. But today, there's this idea that somehow America's past makes it an irredeemable, invalid country. And people have taken that seriously, and they think the remedy for that problem is to destroy America and apparently replace it with something else. So I think that at bottom it's that.
So that's the central cause of social unrest.
Mm-hmm.
Let me describe a friend that I've got.
Yeah.
Not saying I have any closer ties than that, but the friend would say that he sure doesn't hate America. On the other hand, he doesn't think that America is exceptional. And what he would like people to do is to keep in mind that, well, the Lord is Lord of all the nations. And that's the first thing we got to remember. And we've got to find a way through distorted nationalism just as much as we have to find our way through and around a loss of a sense of place.
Uh-huh.
Well, you want to meet a guy like that or not?
Well, I think that it's the lofty principles of America and its American history and its American civil society that I think indicate that there's something special about America, and the lofty principles of America that we have a constitution that codifies universal human rights and appreciates the dignity of the human person. That's something that gives us a way to make contact with any and every society. And we would wish that other societies had a sense of those lofty principles. But often what they do, they look at American history and they cherry pick things out of American history and say, America, look what happened in 1619. Slave ships came over. Look at the institution of slavery. Look at Jim Crow. Look at all these abuses, these negative things, and they think that somehow that makes America an illegitimate society. And in fact, America has been able to address and overcome some of those dark episodes in its history precisely because of the lofty principles that define what America is and emphasize the dignity and the liberty of human beings. And that's a message that America has transmitted throughout the rest of the world. That's one of the ways in which America is a noble nation. America has had great power in the world and has abused it very little with regard to its relations to other countries. We brought Imperial Japan to ruin. We defeated Nazi Germany, and we rebuilt those societies and made them into great democracies and great economic engines of the world. And so there's this tendency to kind of focus on some of the blemishes in America. When you look at a history, you have to look at it warts and all. But there's a tendency now to magnify the warts that obscure the good things about America, and that's just not part of the conversation.
Christopher, your thoughts?
Well, first I would think perhaps it's the notion of America being an exceptional nation that has caused the disappointment. I think of when Chesterton said in his What I Saw in America, I think it was written in 1922, he makes the observation that America is is just as much a creed as it is a nation. And so there's always been a kind of messianic sense states has a special destiny. It's almost like a quasi-church, a political church. And so when you look upon that and you have that idea, and then you contrast it with what you see, especially what we see nowadays, whether your perspective is from what they call the right or whether your perspective is from what they call the left. Right. You're like a disappointed romantic. You thought you married the most beautiful woman, the most virtuous woman in the world, and you find that no, she's not that. So I think a German or a Frenchman can love their nation because simply it's their nation. Our love of our nation is so dependent upon it being the best, being the preeminent nation of the world. And when it seems that that's not the case, that leads to disappointment. That would be my first observation.
Yeah, our expectations have been put so high that even the best nation can't approximate it.
You notice that Christopher said something like what some call the right and some call the left, or words to that effect. And on this show we say from time to time, neither right nor left, just Catholic. Yeah,
that's good advice. That's right. Yeah, the tendency to make things so ideological is part of the problem. And it's ideology that has driven much of the social justice narration that has caused some of this social unrest in the country, because in the educational establishment for a long time, there's been this kind of drumbeat of Marxism that has influenced a couple of generations of people who have gone out and they've insinuated themselves into the society, into the professions, and there's a kind of a Marxist presumption that social justice requires us to change our institutions and the social structures, and because they're founded by the founding, the framers of American society were racists and bigots and slave owners and all this, that America has been stained by white privilege and white supremacy and all this. And so there's this kind of Marxist template by which people look at American society, and they want to deconstruct it. And that's been going on in the education establishment for a long time. So a lot of people take that as axiomatic. One of the ways education takes place in the universities today, and universities are important because it's through the universities that the professions are generated out there in society. And so if you go, a student today goes to a university and is bound to hear America condemned roundly, consistently, and not often is the student going to hear the counterpoint, as we've just mentioned before, that there's another way to look at America too. There's some good things about America, and the student is bound to hear so much of this negativism, and often it comes out in two steps. The professor tries to make the student doubt the values and the traditions of his society, most of which he got from his parents, or she got from her parents. And then the next is you deconstruct Western civilization. And this has gone on long enough where I talk to young people even in middle school, who have already gotten this a dose of this kind of ideology, and they just bought into the idea that America is a systemically unjust society. It's stained by racism and all these deficiencies that have been going on for centuries, and America can't get past it. So what we need is a wholesale revolution. And that's the way Marxists look at it. It's not necessarily like a Bolshevik revolution, although some of those tendencies seem to be showing up with the violence on the streets these days. But it's more that kind of Marxism of Antonio Gramsci, that Italian.
I was waiting for you to mention him.
Yeah.
What is this? The long march through the institutions, right?
The long march through the institutions. So that was the idea. You don't need a violent revolution. You just take over the arms of culture, especially the universities, where professionals are sent out into the world, and you get those people to become true believers, Marxist true believers. They'll go out and they'll change society. And so mainly you do it through the education system, and they've been pretty successful at this.
It's not so much of a long march as it's a long sit through endless meetings.
yeah, unfortunately, that's right. Once you get in the committee, you want to become a revolutionary yourself.
Now, let's have some case studies. You taught for many years at Rockhurst, and I taught for many years at Loyola Marymount. I call it Loyola Marymount, not Loyola Marymount. And I pass over in silence that even though there have been major furloughs, that the university is moving ahead with its plans to build yet another athletic facility, this time that will seat 6,000 people. But I pass that over in silence. Now,
all right.
at Rockhurst, did you see evidence of this kind of process, or is Rockhurst a stable institution?
Well, I think what happens with these Catholic institutions is that they lose the administrators in their effort to be inclusive. They are not very adroit about the people they often hire in. You want a school that's inclusive and where there's diversity. But when you talk about diversity at universities today, they tend to mean identity politics. Diversity of ideas is often in short supply. And so some of these administrators, they will hire people at Catholic schools, the show of inclusiveness. They'll let people in who are basically materialists and atheists and don't really have an interest in or a training in defending Catholic wisdom in the schools. You need a critical mass in a Catholic school of professors who are committed to defending the non-negotiable core of Catholic wisdom, which is that God exists, that there's a human soul, and there's objective morality. I saw over the years at the university I taught at, another Jesuit university, I saw administrators pat themselves on the back, flatter themselves that they were hiring in this professor and that professor, and I knew who those professors were. I knew in some cases they were virulent atheists who were trying to destroy the faith of their students in the classroom. But the administrators, they're off in a separate part of campus. They don't really see this kind of thing. And after a while, you lose the kind of corruption that sets in, and that non-negotiable core of Catholic wisdom is lost at the school. And also you have some professors who see, they interpret Catholic wisdom as just the social gospel. And they see Jesus as a kind of social reformer, and they lose the other part, the corporal works of the Spirit, not just the corporal works of mercy, are also part of Christianity. I mean, Jesus, you read the parable of the wheat and the tares, he made it very clear he was not a social crusader. That's one of the reasons people were disappointed with him. And St. Augustine in the City of God makes it clear that Christianity is not about a political project generating a utopia on earth. That's God's business of the kingdom of heaven. And so I think a lot of these things are confused in contemporary higher education. And then also you get that Howard Zinn, the people's history of the United States start to insinuate itself in the classroom too, where a lot of the classes just, again, try to generate this hatred of America we talked about before. So I saw all that change in the 40 years I was teaching at a Catholic university.
Now, Christopher, you haven't been trapped in the halls of academe, but you've done all kinds of work to, give Catholic secondary education an authentic curriculum. How are things looking from your perspective and from that sort of long-term project?
Well, I'm encouraged by a movement within Catholic education to actually recover the traditions of Catholic education. And there's actually you find this, of course, in the independent Catholic schools, but you're also finding it now in diocesan schools. There are dioceses who are actually promoting what we call Catholic liberal education, and that it's a growing movement. I'm associated with the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education. That's I'm with the Catholic Textbook Project, but we're associated with them, and they're actually working with a large number of schools to change this, and it's happening. It's happening slowly, but it's happening surely, I think. I won't be a prophet and say how many schools will end up adopting, whether we're going to change the face of Catholic parochial education in the near future. But it's happening, and so I find that very encouraging. And on the parish level, I'm not so sure how much Catholicism is being spread, but there seems to be some movement in that direction too, towards a more integral sense of fidelity to the Catholic faith and tradition.
Now, one of the things we've spoken about, and Professor Randall Smith has joined us to speak about this from University of St. Thomas, Houston, is that maintaining authentic Catholic schools is a costly enterprise.
Yes.
It's not easy. And one of the upshots of COVID is that more Catholic schools are going under than had been going under. The rate is picking up. And in any case, there's an economic sacrifice the Catholic families have to make. Will they make it? What do you folks think?
Yeah, I think it's one of the administrators. It's another game they play. They buy a lot of students through sports programs. I've seen that happen at 2 Catholic schools I've taught at. And they do this discounting of tuition where they get students in, and they're being paid by other sources. It gives the impression that there's economic solvency at the school, and they're just really kind of kicking the can down the road. I know a few years ago, I was talking to an administrator at Rockhurst who said there were only 2 students at the university who paid full tuition just out of their parents' pocket, and both of them were sons of African oil men, Nigerian oil tycoons. So you know, as you say, you have to follow the money to see really what's going on. So they have to really be imaginative, and they have to be creative. And there's a kind of an underbelly of finances in these schools that try to keep them afloat. And you just think, well, they're just marking time. This is all. This it's a bubble that's going to burst eventually.
Yeah. I would like to point out the cost of Catholic education. That's a real problem, and it's a real problem because there are a lot of families who just can't afford it. I mean, I've found in cases certain dioceses where there's been an awful lot of generosity on the part of the diocese. There is actually more financial aid available than families know about through Catholic sources. But there is that problem, and it kind of brings it back to what we were saying earlier about Marxism, I think, if I may. I'm not convinced. I think there are Marxist elements, truly Marxist elements. I think a lot of what we see today is not Marxism at all. It's like, for instance, the Bernie Sanders campaign was nothing what you call Marxism. It's more like a democratic socialism, European style. And I think a lot of the people are very confused. I mean, they might use the term Marxist like they use the term liberal and conservative and everything else without understanding what it means. They have a vague idea. But there is. I don't think these ideas, if Marxism is going to become attractive, it becomes attractive because there's a material cause for it. I'm thinking, many years ago when I was in my journalistic phase, I interviewed Rupert Ederer, one of the great American thinker, German-American thinker on Catholic social teaching. We were talking about universal health care, and we were talking about the concept that universal health care is socialist. And he said to me, if we don't begin to have something like that, we're not going to have pseudo-socialism. We're going to have real socialism. So I think that when I living here in Ohio, I see like Columbus is fairly prosperous, but many of the small towns out here are dying. A lot of you have cities like Mansfield, which are dying. This is a phenomenon you see all over the country. You see a lot of young people just not certain what their economic future holds. I think it's mature in academia with adjunct professors now. There is a material cause for this, and it would seem to me that unless this is addressed, we might end up with something like real socialism.
Well, this might be a point, Christopher, to say something about distributism.
Well, yeah, I mean, distributism, that notion that we want to see a distribution, wider distribution of private productive property, right? And that can take many different forms. It can be small shops, it can be small manufacturers. It can also be what they call economic democracy, where the owners of the business are the actual workers there. We actually have something like that nearby here in Columbus, near Columbus. It's an automobile. They sell Hondas, and it's actually employee-owned. It's one of the most prosperous car dealerships in the area. So those kind of ideas could go far, I think, in remedying some of the problems. But when there's no political will, it seems.
Now, Curtis has been involved in various developments, some academic, and I suppose some not quite so academic, in Central Europe. And from what I gather, both in Poland and in Hungary, There's yes, a definite kind of nationalism, and I'm also a little bit leery, but there's also been a real emphasis on meeting fundamental economic needs of families. I wonder, Curtis, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways in which some of the deconstruction in the university today goes on. There's an attempt often to say that the family has become somewhat antiquated, and the family's been redefined, and family's been the bedrock of the civil society. Remember, part of Antonio Gramsci and those people, one of the reasons they had America as a target, America is very conspicuous in the way that bourgeois values have flourished in American society. So it's quite understandable that Marxists would want to try to undo American civil society. And one of the ways you do that is through the family. And this has been, I think, a pernicious effect, and I think it happens in education. The idea of the family is deconstructed, and then you attach that to abortion, and then you attach it to government policies that pretty much ruin the family in Black America. I think in 1960, 13% of children in Black America were born out of wedlock. Now it's 75%. John Blankenhorn years ago wrote that book, Fatherless America, which he said was a pathology in the Black community, largely because of the breakdown of the family. Now, people in Poland, they've come through a communist oppression. They see what's going on in America, and they want no part of that. So part of the nationalism in Poland, I found, is to preserve the sense of the family as the cornerstone of their civil society. And they're very self-conscious about that. And other parts of Europe are not so much, but Poland, I think, stands out that way.
May I interject here?
Yes, please.
I think the problems of the family, though, in the United States are much more deeply rooted than they are in any kind of academic or philosophy, and however influential that might be. I think that if the academic philosophy is influential, it's often because it answers to an already existing problem. I'm thinking the state of the family. There's an interesting work by Cardinal Gibbons, whose title I can't recall right now, but where he bemoans, this is in the 1880s, the ease by which divorce was obtainable in the United States, and the high rates of divorce he talks about. Of course, by modern standards, they seem very low, but by his standards and by compared to European standards. I think also of there was a German priest in Cincinnati, whose name I can't recall right now, I'm sorry, but he wrote...
Christopher is just getting interested in ARP, American Association of Retired Persons, and this memory thing is it's one of the incentives he has. But go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Right. So the comment he makes is that America is a land of free love and divorce and sectarianism. And then finally, I mean, they have Theodore Roosevelt himself, who he gave a talk to Protestant ministers in the 1920s, not the 20s, but when he was president. And I just want to quote this. He was bemoaning the fact, he says, the Anglo-American culture is not reproducing itself. His stock, as he called it. He said something like, if you do not believe in your own stock enough to visit to see the stock, to wish to see the stock kept up, then you are not good Americans, you are not patriots. I, for one, shall not mourn your extinction. And in such event, I shall welcome the advent of a new race that will take your place, because you will have shown that you are not fit to cumber the ground. I bring these up because it seems, I think there's a kind of the spirit of individualism and the sense of American freedom oftentimes is the cause of the destruction of the family. So it's something really endemic to our culture. And
yet, you mentioned Chesterton earlier. Chesterton, in a famous, wonderful essay on vows, taking vows, says that very often, and there he is speaking from England, we think that vows are impossible. And why is that? He says, because we have so unsure a sense of who we are that we can't make an appointment with ourselves for the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Christopher mentions individualism. That's one of the things that I think is singularly attacked in universities implicitly and explicitly today, and they do that through the mechanism of social justice. See, Catholic justice was always pretty much the way justice was looked at by the ancient Greeks. Because we have a social nature, justice is automatically social. But where did that adjective social get attached to social justice? That comes from Marxism, so that social justice becomes a kind of Marxist trope in which one transfers the idea of justice from personal responsibility to social structures. So accordingly, a just society is only achievable through institutional change. And then the social justice warriors play this game in which they divide people into groups, and then they stereotype the groups, and they pit the groups into each other, and then they play the game of victimology in the cultural rhetoric. And after a while, the reality of social life becomes the social structures, the collective, and the individual is lost, and individualism becomes a throwback to ways of looking at the world that are now considered passé. And so that's another way in which the Marxism, I think, has been insinuated in the education system.
Let me throw a couple things in here, and as usual, at least one of them is utterly trivial. You use the word trope, and there are various words, once you get to be in your 50s, like I am, there are various words that come of age suddenly. Most notorious example is iconic. Used to be I'd see icons when we went to church, and now every time you turn around, there's something iconic. But trope, I don't think that a lot of people really know what the deuce a trope is. Could you say something about what a trope is, and then I'll go on from that to something more substantive?
Well, it probably comes from the Greek word trophos, which means to turn. So you turn something to a dogmatic way, looking at something. It becomes a presumption, which explains everything else you put forward.
Well, it's a kissing cousin of a shibboleth.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. That's right.
All right, watch out when you see these cousins kissing, especially in public. All right, now, next thing. Social justice, it is the case, and I'm sure Christopher is more attuned to particular locations and citations than am I, but it is the case that papal social teaching uses the term social justice, right?
Right.
And it is the case that in classical accounts of justice, there's a place for what's called distributive justice. We have commutative justice. Mario's not on with us today, but I've been trying to get him to pay me back that $20 I loaned him for years now. There's commutative justice, and then there's also distributive justice. And could you say a little bit more about the term social justice? And doubtless it's abuses, but there is a distinction between justice that one individual owes to another and justice that a group of individuals owe to another group of individuals, surely.
Yeah, I think that's been part of Christian moral teaching, is that because human beings are social by nature, in fact, we have to remember that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and God himself is a community of three persons. So it all goes into the dignity of the person. It's all through the lens of personalism that makes us understand that justice has to be social. And Christianity calls us to be unselfish, to call us out of ourselves. So Christianity, it seems to me, if we just kept our old-fashioned Christian religion, that would be the remedy for a lot of these problems that the social justice warriors.
An anecdotal aside, the developments of a kind of a reflective, thoughtful American conservatism, Russell Kirk insisted that in important documents the term individual be replaced by the term person. Yeah.
Well, I think social justice represents a transformation just the way tolerance represents a transformation. Social justice becomes an excuse to stereotype people. Leftists always tell you that they hate stereotyping, but they are masters of stereotyping, and they put people into groups and then have a kind of collectivist way of explaining society after that, and that plays to their advantage. So you have to call them on this from the get-go, and one of the ways you do that is to say, be careful about this language of social justice. Let's just keep to old-fashioned justice, because justice by its very nature, affecting the way you relate to other people, is already social. And so they've taken the word justice and they've perverted it and transformed it, and you have to expose that. And another word they've abused is the word tolerance. Tolerance to mean that justice required that in order for us to get along, we had to live with people whose views we disagreed with, even seriously disagreed with them. But today, that's not what tolerance means anymore. Tolerance today is a way in which you authenticate yourself as a human person. You show that you're an enlightened person fit to live in modern society in such a way that you don't want to judge anybody at all, except those who are politically incorrect. And if someone's politically incorrect, you can judge them till the cows come home, and that's considered perfectly acceptable, because an enlightened person doesn't accept what's politically incorrect, only what's politically correct. And that's why so many people who claim to be tolerant can be so vicious in practice with regard to people they disagree with. So social justice and tolerance are expressions that have changed.
Two more test cases. How would you assess the fate of, in recent times, Junipero Serra and Father Damien, St. Damien of Molokai?
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, they took down that statue of Junipero Serra out there in California. And that, again, I think the vantage point of Christian personalism puts all these things in perspective. We're taught that nobody is perfect, and yet our Redeemer does seek to redeem us, and you can put people in perspective in this way. So Junipero Serra, living in the 18th and 19th century, he's going to have there's a customary way in which he did certain things that, looking back, may not have been always advisable, but on balance, he's still a great man. And so tearing down his statue, a monument to him, seems to lose that perspective.
I could give you a little color commentary from California.
Yeah?
Almost every Catholic school in California has a statue in front of it of Father Serra.
Really?
Almost everyone. Our parish does. The parish that we sometimes go to does. Where I taught, Loyola Marymount has one in front of the library. And now this is just the messy, silly side of history. All of these statues looked, widely remarked, a great deal like the donor who gave all these statues.
That's curious.
So whenever you look at something up close and personal of a historical sort, there are these little twists and idiosyncrasies. But now my take on Serra is that most of the things that people charge him with happened after he was gone. And AOC's comment about Father Damien, his being a part of the legacy of colonialism, is just asked backwards, because he was somebody who was hugely admired by Hawaiians, and he did them an enormous service, and he did not come to make money. He came to share in their fate, leprosy. So it sure helps if you just get the basic facts sorted out. So often, a good chunk of the problem, I believe in the 10 leaky buckets approach towards explanations. You need 10 different factors, none of which explains the whole thing, but all 10 of them together will do it. There's just such ignorance and incompetence. It's just really something. But, okay, Christopher, Curtis and I have been jabbering for a while. Could you join in and get us situated again?
I would like to briefly turn back to the whole question of social justice in terms of that social. I'm not sure if I've understood you entirely, because social justice does, in Catholic sense, call for structural change. I think of Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno talking about structural change that should be made in the society in terms of a kind of restoration of a guild system, what I call a vertical syndicate. Pope Benedict XVI more recently talked about systems of redistribution have to be set up in place. Pope John Paul II talked about structures of sin, that those structures of sin have to be replaced by other structures. And I think, of course, the latest is Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which talks about structural changes that have to be made in order to ensure proper care of the environment and economic justice. So it seems that the whole question of structure is an integral part of justice in society, whether you want to call it social justice or whatever, from the Catholic perspective and not from the Marxist perspective.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. It's the reductionism that's the problem, where the human person gets lost, and what the reality of human life is just the political structure. It's certainly the case, and Catholicism has always understood this, that human beings are very much bound to be influenced by culture and economics and politics. And to that extent, the Marxists are right, and anyone who understands that social structures are a fact of life, that's right. But the human person ultimately is the driver of all of this, and we can't. It's what is the impact of these structures on the human person? But what the Marxists do is they turn it into a collectivist kind of ontology, where the reality of social life is just the collectivist structures, and the human person doesn't exist. The human person is an old bourgeois way of thinking, and that is anti-Catholic to think of the person that way, and to dismiss the human person. So that's what I was getting.
Yeah, but so does a system of capitalism, where the justification oftentimes for economic progress and the fact that some people had to suffer terribly is that it's better for the next generation. That seems to me to be reductionism as well. That certain people are expendable for the sake of some common good. I'm not a common good, but a greater good. I'm not so sure that fundamentally many of the ideals we've held to in the United States are so different from a Marxist perspective.
Yeah, I think you're right about capitalism has reason to be criticized and faulted because it loses sight of the human person as well, especially in this age of free market, global capitalist economics. Those crusaders of that kind of economic worldview think nothing about pretty much just wiping out, eradicating, blighting traditional economic, social structures that have been around for years in different places. So too bad for, you mentioned rural Ohio, too bad for rural Ohio. That's just collateral damage because of the expansion of the global free market. So you're right, that's the dark side of capitalism. It suffers the same kind of problem. A loss of respect for the locality and the subsidiarity of the human person.
Gosh, we have our work cut out for us just in terms of trying to analyze competing systems that claim way too much for themselves. I'd like to stop just for a couple of moments, maybe as many as 6, on the concept of the bourgeois. There's a fellow, James Wilson, a poet, who's at Villanova, as I recall, excellent poet. And a recent essay of his was on the importance of bourgeois values. And he spoke, as you might expect, in terms of a number of fairly recent poets who really came from a bourgeois background. And another, never mind the poets, a saint who came from a bourgeois background, as that term is sometimes used, is the little flower. Now,
yeah.
If by bourgeois we mean families concerned with basic economic stability, families concerned with a kind of moral stability, families that take education seriously, that take productive labor seriously, I'm all for it. But now, there's another term, bourgeois, and bourgeois, as, say, Jacques Maritain would use it, is inextricably linked not only with the individual, but with the mediocre. You know, you're not going to run into many discussions of the genius for transcendence of the bourgeois. Because there ain't any genius for transcendence among the bourgeois, given a certain meaning. So as with social justice, as with bourgeois, as with most things that most philosophers talk about, we constantly have to work for conceptual clarity. And that's fatiguing. And I think that's one of the reasons why the tropes have their sway and have their day. It's so easy to give up and allow the thought blockers, like liberal, conservative, radical, progressive, let the thought blockers take over the civil discourse that gets shredded. So that's my... Curtis, I'm allowed one rant per show, and that was the rant. No.
Well, I'm glad you used that word transcendence.
We have been talking about all kinds of difficult questions, but there's one question that we want to talk about for sure, and we're down to the last 10 minutes, and we'll be lucky if we get anywhere near talking about this in an adequate way. What's the deal with policing in America? There's a kind of a structure, police forces, and they're individual policemen. And here in Los Angeles, the cars have a motto on the side of them, the police cars, to protect and to serve. And yet, the last big riot, 1992 in Los Angeles, had to do with a fellow, and this was one of the earlier video camera things, a fellow who was pulled out of a car and beaten nearly to a pulp by 14 or 15 policemen. And we have absolute necessity for civil order, and we have the whole problem of, back to Plato, right, who will watch the watchman? Yeah. What are some of your thoughts here, Curtis?
Yeah, it's obviously a very sensitive issue for the reasons you mentioned, but it's somehow creating a sense of balance, a proportion, a perspective on all this, because we need the police, and the police on balance do well, but you certainly have these instances of rogue cops. You think there's hostility in the culture now. Wait what happens when those three policemen with Derek Chauvin up there in Minneapolis get acquitted when the trial happens there, and they've overcharged them, so that it's very possible that may happen. And Derek Chauvin himself will probably get something like depraved indifference or negligent homicide or something, because it's going to be hard to make the case to a jury that he did what he did by premeditated racism, which seems to be the charge they're handing down. So we may see an explosion after that kind of thing. So this is a way of saying that the police have a very difficult job to do, and there are certainly rogue policemen out there. But on balance, the police are an institution we should respect. One of the things that needs to be done is there needs to be a way of addressing rogue policemen in police establishments when they show up. Now, one of the reasons this doesn't happen is because of the politicians. One of the reasons Amy Klobuchar was not named vice president for Biden was because when she was chief prosecutor of Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is, she often got complaints about Derek Chauvin. But because she was courting the police union vote, which tends to vote Democratic, she would often give him a pass. So he had 19 complaints against him, and Amy Klobuchar excused those complaints or looked past them. Actually, what she did, she sent them to a grand jury and let them decide, so she washed her hands of the issue. So you have this kind of tradition where rogue cops aren't dealt with because of some of the political corruptions that take place. But there's this narration out there that somehow the police are out or animated by going out and killing black people indiscriminately. And there are all kinds of umpteen studies to show that that's not the case. The Washington Post itself became self-conscious about this, and since 2015, they've been giving statistics about this. The woman whose name escapes me right now, who at the Manhattan Institute wrote that book, The War on Cops.
Heather McDonald.
Heather McDonald, yes. She's done exquisite work in dealing with some of the statistics on this. I know I read the statistics from last year from the FBI Uniform Code of Statistics and the Washington Post, and said that last year there were 375 million contacts between the police and residents in America. Of those 375 million contacts, there were 10 million arrests. But in the context of those contacts, there were 1,004 fatal shootings. Among those fatal shootings, there were 41 that involved unarmed suspects. Now, the narration would have you believe, well, okay, 41 people were shot who were unarmed. Those surely had to be all black people, right? Well, the statistics don't bear that out. It turns out that of those 41, 21 were white and 9 were black. And in fact, there's a great disincentive on the part of white policemen to shoot a black suspect because they know there are all kinds of possible reprisals that might happen. So the facts seem to shed a different light on this narration. But once the narration gets started, it's, as Mark Twain said, once a lie gets halfway around the world before truth gets its boots on.
In a way, I'm led to think, and I guess I'm often led to think in terms of what Chesterton says is the most verified of all Christian doctrines, original sin. And here's the connection. You see material suggesting, and I think this is right, that the greatest source of killing of young black males is other young black males.
Right.
And then you think, how's about this? Most prevalent and dangerous form of violence is domestic violence, where some husband shoots his wife, or some wife poisons her husband, or some live-in boyfriend, common law or uncommon law, kills the baby. And the human propensity for violence is just staggering.
Yeah.
And you'll have to forgive this aside, but one thing leads to another. We're in the process right now of nuclear rearmament. The Holy Father says that, and Dorothy Day said this long before, I always say that insofar as I grew up as a Catholic worker. The very possession of nuclear weapons is wrong. And what are we doing? Trump isn't going to say that. Biden isn't going to say that. And in fact, since Obama, what we've been doing is very carefully rearming, strengthening our nuclear arsenal. We don't have the number of weapons, but the weapons we have are more lethal, if that's possible, than they were in the past. So we're sitting on an absolutely unstable, beyond powder keg situation. We human beings who are so given to violence. Mm-hmm. God help us.
And you use the word unstable because we don't have the luxury of the mutually assured destruction paradigm that we have with the Soviet Union. Now we've got people like Kim Jong-un and some of these other more difficult variables to deal with.
Christopher, we're getting close on the end. According to my clock, we got 4 minutes left. Not that we're going to be intimidated by that, but do you have some further thoughts before we start to wind up?
Yeah, I guess my thought on what's the answer, what's the response. The response, I'm not convinced. I mean, there are Catholic critics of the American tradition. A growing number of them now. And what they're pointing to is that we have to recover as Catholics what's unique, essentially a kind of to move away from a society which is seen as ordered to human liberty to a society which is ordered to the common good, which, it does include, I guess in personalist language that would be towards the person. But from my tradition, it's more the common good in which the person has by necessity to participate. It's
East Taconic all the way, Curtis.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, so I think my rant for today, since Jim gets to have rants, I get to have them sometimes.
Good for you. Go for it. It's contagious.
No, my thought would be simply this, is that what we have to recover as Catholics is not return so much to the American tradition and hold that up as the ideal to which we should strive, but to look at that tradition critically and embrace with whatever is in it is right, but always reestablish it within the context of Catholic teaching about the nature of man as person, but also the nature of society as ordered to the common good, and ultimately ordered to, the natural society being ordered to a natural end, but never that natural end has reference to the supernatural end. And until we Catholics do that, because I really do believe we have the key to the questions that are being asked by our society and the struggles in which it's undergoing. But I don't think we do it enough. We align ourselves with one political faction in the United States or another, and we become to think like them. But we have to really transcend that. I guess that would be my rant for today.
It's good. Now, guys, the idea of the common good has been made too much, has been forgotten, and things are cast in ideological polarities. You're quite right. But I think I go back to the person that puts in perspective the principle of the common good. And the common good has been perverted into kind of a Marxist doctrine of identity politics, in which you're born into a social structure and you can't ever get out of it or transcend it. And part of the genius of the Christian view of the human person is that we're endowed with intellect and will, and our intellect enables us to transcend our circumstances. So it doesn't follow that people are locked into these divisive hostilities permanently. You can be someone in early 1800s Britain, and because you are a Christian, you can imagine what it would be like to be a slave, and you can set in motion an attempt politically to engineer the abolition of slavery, which is what Bishop Wilberforce did. And so human beings have that ability to transcend their circumstances, but the modern rather neo-Marxist ideologies that were imprisoned in these identities, and they play to that politics. So a robust sense of the Catholic principle of the common good, as you were saying, Christopher, is a remedy for so much of that. It helps us more analogically understand how this all relates and gets away from these ideological polarities, or turning the common good into just a collectivist notion.
Important considerations. Before we close in prayer, one piece of heartening news for the American Solidarity Party is that we're now either by name on enough state ballots or by authorized write-in status. You can't just write in Mickey Mouse. You have to have some credibility to be written in to be an authorized write-in candidate. At any rate, we're now on the ballot by name or authorized as a write-in option in enough states so that we could win the electoral vote.
Really? Wow. Congratulations. That's not a modest achievement.
That took a lot of work. A lot of work. And back in the day, last time around, 4 years ago, we were on the ballot in one state, Colorado. Now, we could actually win. Of course, we're not going to win, but have we ever made some progress?
Yeah.
So there's room for civic action of a fresh and principled sort.
Yeah.
We end then with the gospel for today, taken from the gospel according to Luke. Jesus summoned the 12 and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them to proclaim the kingdom of God, to heal the sick. He said to them, "Take nothing for the journey, neither walking stick, nor sack, nor food, nor money, and let no one take a second tunic. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and leave from there. And as for those who do not welcome you, when you leave that town, shake the dust from your feet in testimony against them." Then they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and curing diseases everywhere. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thanks again, Curtis.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Christopher. Enjoyed it. Very engaging conversation.
All right. We'll be knocking on your door once again now that you're so retired.
Please do. Please do, anytime.
And watch out for those senior Signify marches. They're tricky. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you all. Bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.